I paid for my daughter's wedding out of my savings, and then she said I wasn't pretty enough to be in the wedding and kicked me out. I had spent over 30 years saving for something I couldn't even name. It began simply, quietly, like most habits we carry for decades without question. Every time I folded a $10 bill into the small envelope tucked inside the recipe book drawer, or set aside a little more from my monthly check instead of buying a new coat, I wasn't thinking of anything specific. Maybe it was for a rainy day. Maybe it was for someone else. Maybe, in some part of me, I was saving to be seen, to be needed, to matter. That envelope became a folder, then an account. Over the years it grew, modestly but steadily, until it was a quiet kind of cushion I never spoke about. Not to friends, not even to my late husband, Paul, who always left the finances to me. After he passed, I kept it going. I tightened our already small life into something smaller still. I clipped coupons, I patched clothes, I never travelled. When neighbours asked why I never upgraded the kitchen or replaced the squeaky car, I'd smile and say I liked things the way they were. And I did. I liked knowing that if something terrible happened, I could survive it. I liked knowing I had a choice. What I didn't realise, what took me too long to see, was how easily that kind of quiet strength could be mistaken for passivity. Or worse, invisibility. When my daughter, Lila, announced she was getting married, I felt something light up in me that I hadn't felt in years. Not just happiness, though of course I was happy, but purpose. At the time, I didn't realize how hungry I was to be useful again, to be asked, included, relied upon. I had raised Lila mostly on my own. Paul had always been kind, but distant. A good man in the general sense, but not a present one. He loved us the way men of his generation often did, in principle. But the day-to-day was mine. I had walked her through fevers and heartbreaks, through spelling tests and scraped knees, and I had always told myself that one day, when the time came, she would see what I had done, really see it. The wedding, I thought, would be that moment. And so when she and Jeremy, her fiancé, a quiet man with a sharp jaw and a soft voice, came to me and said gently, "We're trying to keep the budget reasonable," I offered before they could ask. "I'll cover it," I said. They blinked, surprised. Lila hesitated. "Mum, that's a lot." But I just smiled and said, "I've been saving for this since before you were born." It was true. Not intentionally, not consciously, but with every small sacrifice, I had built a future for her. I was proud to give it, to give her a day without compromise. The weeks that followed were full of planning, swatches, spreadsheets, Pinterest boards, and panicked phone calls about floral arrangements. I didn't mind. I sat through fittings. I approved deposits. I drove across the county to look at venues and left generous tips for every vendor we booked. It was exhausting and expensive. But it didn't matter. She was my daughter. And I thought, in the quiet, vulnerable part of me I never spoke aloud, that this was the culmination of all the unseen things I'd done for decades. This was where my devotion would be acknowledged. Maybe not publicly, maybe not in a speech, but privately, in a look, a hand squeezed during photos, a whispered thank you in the dressing room. I didn't expect grandeur, just a place, a chair at the table, a role in her joy. But as the months passed, small things began to change. The phone calls became less frequent, the updates vaguer. I'd hear about decisions already made, the menu, the guest list, the decor. And when I gently asked, Lila would say, "Oh, I didn't think you'd care about the details." Or, "It was just a small thing, Mom. You're not into this stuff." I swallowed it, again and again. I told myself she was busy. Weddings are stressful. I shouldn't be so sensitive. Then came the dress conversation. I had planned to wear a pale blue gown I'd found online. Simple, elegant, flattering. I even had it tailored, despite the cost, because I wanted to look like someone who belonged in the photographs. But when I showed Lila the picture, she hesitated, just for a moment. Then she smiled, too wide, and said, "It's sweet, Mum, but the colour palette's a little warmer. Maybe something beige, something that blends in." Blends in. I nodded. I didn't argue. I bought another dress, beige. It looked like something a woman 10 years older might wear to a doctor's office. I told myself it didn't matter. But the final blow came 1 week before the wedding. I had offered to help set up the reception, folding programs, arranging centerpieces. Lila told me not to worry about it. Then, 2 days later, I overheard, by accident, through an open phone line while trying to confirm a detail with the florist, that she and Jeremy had decided the aesthetic of the wedding was too curated to include unphotogenic guests in key photos. Unphotogenic. She was talking about me. Later that night, I confronted her gently, still unsure, still hoping I had misunderstood. She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She just said, flatly, "Mum, it's nothing personal. It's a design decision. You'll still be there, of course. Just not in the bridal party shots. And we're doing a more intimate processional, so it's best if you're seated before everything starts." I stared at her, searching her face for irony. There was none. I had paid for the wedding. Every dress, every flower, every bite of food, every glass of champagne. And I wasn't invited to stand beside my daughter. 2 days later, I received a polite but final message from Lila. "Mum, we've decided to keep the ceremony very streamlined. There won't be room for everyone at the main table. Hope you understand." She didn't say not to come, but I knew what it meant. And so I didn't. I sat in my quiet house that Saturday afternoon, the one that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old photo albums, and listened to the silence that had once meant safety, now echo with rejection. I had saved for a future I wasn't allowed to witness. And in that silence, something in me, something slow and long-suffering, finally cracked. I had given them everything. And now, I would take myself back. The Sunday after the wedding, I woke earlier than usual. There was no reason to, no alarm, no obligation, but I couldn't seem to sleep past dawn anymore. The sunlight in the bedroom had that soft, hesitant quality that comes in early spring, when the cold still lingers in the air, despite the calendar insisting it should be otherwise. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, not moving, not even thinking in full sentences, just breathing in the quiet. My hands rested on my knees, and I studied the veins rising under my skin, thin blue lines tracing the years back to some younger version of myself I could barely remember. A woman who once rocked a crying baby in the middle of the night and hummed lullabies with cracked lips and tired eyes. A woman who saved small, invisible amounts from grocery money so her daughter could have new ballet shoes, even when it meant her own heels would wear down until they flapped against the pavement. A woman who had always believed that love, real love, was made of invisible work, silent loyalty, showing up. I didn't cry that morning. I'd done enough of that the night before, when the pictures began to appear. First just a few, then dozens, all over social media, all through the accounts of friends and distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. The wedding looked beautiful. I won't lie and say it didn't. Lila stood under a white arch, strung with delicate glass orbs and eucalyptus, her dress elegant and shimmering, her makeup understated, glowing. Jeremy looked nervous in that charming way young grooms do, and the bridal party was carefully curated, all symmetrical smiles and filtered skin. The captions read like cliches, "The happiest day of our lives, surrounded by love, a perfect beginning." I looked at each photo, one after another, and felt not anger, but a kind of detached awe. I had paid for all of it, not just the food and the flowers. I had paid for the light in those pictures, the roof over their heads, the champagne in their hands. I had paid for their perfect beginning, and I wasn't in a single frame, not even one. There are many kinds of cruelty. Some are loud, obvious, cinematic. Others are subtler, the kind you can deny even while you're doing them. The kind you wrap in words like boundaries and aesthetic and vision. But make no mistake, exclusion is cruelty too, especially when done with a smile. I made tea. I took it to the living room and sat in the armchair that had once belonged to my mother, the upholstery worn down at the arms where her hands used to rest. I ran my fingers over the fabric and tried to remember the last time someone had touched me with affection. Not a brush of the arm in passing, not a perfunctory peck on the cheek, but a real, grounding gesture of love. I couldn't recall. That thought struck deeper than anything else. The phone rang once around noon. It was Joyce, my neighbour and old friend, who had seen the photos too, and whose voice carried the hesitant warmth of someone trying to offer comfort without inflaming a wound. She didn't ask why I wasn't there. She just said, "I made extra soup, hun. Want me to bring you some?" And I said yes, not because I was hungry, but because sometimes kindness feels like the only thread that keeps you from unraveling entirely. When she arrived, she didn't say much. She set the container down on the counter, gave me a long look, and then, without ceremony, reached for my hand. That small gesture broke something in me, not into grief, but into gratitude. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer explanations. She simply sat with me as we drank soup and listened to the clock tick against the silence. After she left, I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the narrow strip of lawn I'd tended for years. The tulips had started to poke through the dirt again, little green fists determined to rise. It struck me then how stubborn growth really is. It happens beneath everything, even when ignored, even when unwanted. You can pave over it, bury it, dismiss it, but it comes back, quietly, slowly, on its own terms. That night, I opened the notebook where I used to keep grocery lists and began a new page. Not a diary, not a journal, a record. I titled it, in small, steady letters, "What Was Taken." I listed the money first. Every payment I had made, every deposit, every check. I pulled out receipts, email confirmations, paper trails I hadn't thrown away. Then I began listing the smaller things. The dress I never wore, the photo I was never in, the toast I never heard, the name never spoken. With each line, the act of writing became something physical, like stacking bricks, building a wall between what I had endured and what I was no longer willing to accept. I knew I couldn't undo what had been done. I knew no letter or confrontation would erase that day or what it revealed. But I could choose what happened next. I could decide, finally, whether I wanted to spend the rest of my life waiting to be included, or whether I would write myself back into the center of my own story. I didn't know what form that would take yet. I didn't have a plan. But for the first time in years, I felt the beginning of one forming in the background of my mind. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. And I knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has been overlooked one too many times, that this wasn't going to be a story about what they did. It was going to be a story about what I did next. In the days that followed, something shifted inside me, not in a dramatic or cinematic way, but gradually, like a room filling with light at sunrise. There were no speeches, no sudden breakthroughs, just a growing awareness that I had spent the better part of my life folding myself down to fit into corners other people had left for me, that I had lived as an afterthought in spaces I had built with my own hands. And now, for the first time in a long while, I began to ask myself a question I had never dared to. What would it look like to live fully at the center of my own life? The question was both exhilarating and terrifying, because I didn't know the answer. My days had always been about others. First my parents, then my husband, then Lila. Even after Paul passed, I had found ways to stay small, to stay useful, to stay needed. It's easy to confuse usefulness with love. But when Lila pushed me out of the very celebration I had funded, not just logistically, but symbolically, something was laid bare. I was not needed, not in the way I had hoped, not in the way that sees you and honors you. I was convenient when I was quiet, difficult when I had a presence. And that was the worst kind of erasure, the one wrapped in politeness, camouflaged as consideration. So I began, slowly, to reclaim space. At first it was as simple as rearranging the living room. It sounds trivial, I know, but there was something deeply defiant in moving the furniture to suit myself, not to host others, not to preserve the arrangement Paul had preferred, but for me. I pulled the sofa closer to the window so the afternoon sun would fall directly onto my reading chair. I donated the stiff armchair that no one ever used, but I had kept, just in case. I brought the good dishes down from the high cabinet and began eating off them, alone, on ordinary Tuesdays, because I was tired of saving beauty for guests who never came. Then I began going through the paperwork. Not just the wedding receipts, those were already catalogued in my growing notebook, but the rest of it, my will, my financial records, my insurance documents, my property deeds. I wanted to understand exactly where I stood. I wanted no illusions, no blind spots. Over the years, I had allowed Marcus, my financial advisor and a friend of Paul's from work, to handle the bulk of my portfolio. But I had never asked many questions. I had trusted. He had always been courteous, professional, and for a long time I assumed that was enough. But now I no longer believed in passive trust. So I made an appointment with him, under the pretense of reviewing annual returns, and I showed up with a folder in hand and a pen ready. The meeting was cordial, the kind of stiff civility that masks discomfort. He glanced at my notes and said, with a smile too wide, "You don't need to worry. You're in good hands." But I did worry. Not because I thought he had done anything malicious, but because I had relinquished understanding. And that, I realized, was no longer acceptable. I asked him to print out full transaction records from the past 5 years. He blinked, surprised. "Of course, if you really want them," he said, as if I'd asked for a favor, not a right. I nodded. "Yes, I do." He printed them. I took the folder home and spent the next several nights reading through every page. I circled fees I hadn't remembered approving. I made notes in the margins. I began to understand how much had slipped through the cracks. Not just dollars, but decisions. And with each page, I felt something unfamiliar but unmistakable rise in me. A sense of ownership, not just over my money, but over my time, my voice, my direction. The notebook filled quickly. I no longer called it "What Was Taken." I had retitled it "What I'm Taking Back." Around the same time, I began distancing myself, quietly, without announcement, from the social orbit that had once revolved around Lila. I stopped commenting on her posts. I stopped pretending. When she sent a casual text a week after the wedding, "Hope you're doing okay. Crazy week," I responded with a single sentence. "I am doing well, thank you." No warmth, no invitation to continue. She didn't reply. There was a time when that silence would have gutted me. But now, I simply closed the message thread and opened a different one. A conversation with a woman I hadn't seen in years, someone from my book club before Paul got sick. I asked if she was still reading anything good. She replied within the hour and invited me to join her for coffee on Thursday. I went. I sat in the little cafe on Elm Street, the one with chipped teacups and warm banana bread, and I laughed more in one afternoon than I had in months. We didn't talk about weddings or daughters or disappointments. We talked about books, old movies, how spring was coming late again this year. It felt like opening a window in a room I'd forgotten had air. And when I got home, I sat down in my rearranged living room with the golden sun pouring across my knees, and I wrote in my notebook, "I'm not waiting to be chosen anymore." I didn't know where this path would lead yet, whether to confrontation, to reinvention, or simply to quiet self-respect. But I knew it was mine, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. Spring came late that year, as if the world itself had decided to pause before blooming. The cherry blossoms that usually erupted like pink confetti along the sidewalks near my house stayed tight in their buds, waiting out the lingering cold. I found comfort in that, in the idea that even nature sometimes takes longer to open. I walked more than usual, wrapped in the old green coat I hadn't worn since Paul passed, and I noticed things I'd stopped noticing long ago. The squeak of the front gate, the way the neighbour's dog barked only at trucks, the way light shifted across the hedges by 4 o'clock. These were small details, but they rooted me in the present in a way grief never had. Grief, I had learned, always pointed backward. Attention pointed forward. And I was choosing to pay attention. My days began to take shape around new routines. Not grand or transformative, but intentional. I made myself breakfast on real plates, not paper ones. I returned to the small library downtown, revived my card, and began working through a list of novels I had once wanted to read, but never made time for. I reorganized the linen closet. I began baking again, not for others, but because I liked the smell of cinnamon in the house. These may sound like trivialities, but to a woman who had long measured her worth by how much she gave, doing something solely for the sake of quiet enjoyment felt radical. One morning, while reorganizing a drawer in the hallway, I found a bundle of old letters, most of them from Lila, written during her time at university. Handwritten, folded carefully, with little hearts above the eyes and exaggerated exclamation points. I sat down on the hallway floor, the sun slanting through the window behind me, and read them one by one. She had once told me everything: who she liked, what she feared, how homesick she felt on stormy nights. There was a sweetness in those letters that I had long forgotten, a younger version of her who hadn't yet learned to edit herself, who still saw me as her first anchor, her safest place. I wept, not out of sorrow, but for all the time that had passed since I had last felt that closeness, and for the realization that it may never return. I could not grieve someone who was still alive, but I could mourn the space between us. Later that day, I did something I hadn't planned. I sat at the kitchen table, pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and wrote Lila a letter, not to confront, not to accuse, just to speak. I told her I had seen the wedding photos. I told her they were beautiful. And then I told her the truth. Not in anger, but in plain, unsentimental words. I said I had hoped to be there, not just as her mother, but as someone who had helped build the foundation beneath her feet. I said I understood that weddings were complicated, that aesthetics mattered, that choices were made. But I also told her that exclusion is not softened by good intentions, that being left out of something you paid for is not less painful because the day was lovely. And finally, I said this: I have loved you all my life, but love does not mean disappearing. I will always care for you, Lila, but I will not make myself small to stay near you. That is not the kind of mother I want to be anymore. I didn't send it. I folded it and placed it in the notebook, where it joined the rest of my quiet documentation, a growing archive not of resentment, but of awakening. In the weeks that followed, Lila did not call. I didn't expect her to. But word reached me, indirectly, through a cousin, then a friend of a friend. She had noticed my silence. She was perhaps confused by it. There were murmurs about me being cold, about me pulling away. It was strange, how quickly they noticed my absence when it was no longer convenient. But I didn't explain myself. Explanation, I had come to believe, was often a form of pleading, and I was done pleading. Instead, I moved forward. I attended a book group at the library and listened to women my age and older discuss protagonists who had chosen themselves too late, or not at all. I volunteered once a week at a small community pantry where people didn't ask why I was there, only if I could hand them another bag. I cleaned out Paul's old workroom, painted the walls a soft grey, and turned it into a sewing space, something I hadn't had since before Lila was born. I found fabric I had stored in bins for decades and ran my fingers across it like visiting old friends. There was peace in that. There was identity. And with every stitch, every chapter read, every batch of muffins baked for no one in particular, I felt the foundation under me settle, not with the weight of sacrifice, but with the fullness of self. I had not abandoned my daughter. I had simply returned to myself. Sometimes the only way to realize how far you've receded is to stop moving altogether. Not in despair, not in panic, but with a kind of heavy stillness that allows the truth to settle around you like dust in sunlight. I found myself doing that more often, pausing in the middle of rooms, between tasks, in doorways I had passed through 1,000 times. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was just standing still, letting myself exist. Not as a helper, not as a host, not as someone adjacent to someone else's importance, but as a person, fully present in her own space. It was unfamiliar at first, disorienting even. For decades, my life had been built around movement, around tending to others, solving small emergencies, smoothing over edges. And now there were no emergencies, no errands left to run for someone else's sake, just quiet, and the realization that I'd spent most of my adult life in service of a story that didn't include me past the first few chapters. I had never asked for applause, but I had expected recognition, not in a public speech or a flowery toast, just in the way a daughter might look at her mother across a crowded room and think, "She got me here. She matters." But that look never came. And so, in its absence, I began to look at myself differently. It started with my name. I went to the bank and removed Lila as a secondary contact on all of my accounts. She had never asked to be added. I had done it after Paul died, out of habit, out of fear of emergencies, out of some old idea of preparedness. But now, It felt like one more way I had allowed my life to be quietly handed off to someone else's comfort. The teller didn't ask many questions. She simply nodded, clicked through her screen, and said, "You're all set." I left with a strange feeling in my chest. Not pride, not regret, but something like reclaiming a birthright I hadn't realized I'd given away. Next came the house. I sat down with a lawyer recommended by Joyce's son, a kind man named Victor, who wore 2 large glasses and carried a quiet steadiness I found immediately comforting. We reviewed my will, my power of attorney documents, and the small but meaningful list of assets I still held in my name. He asked careful, thoughtful questions. I gave careful, thoughtful answers. We revised the documents together, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I removed assumptions. I removed old emotional debris. I added language that was precise, direct, and honest. "I'm not trying to punish anyone," I said as we finished the last form. "I just want to ensure that the next time someone makes a decision about my life, it's because I asked them to." He nodded, and I left that office feeling taller. Around this time, I also stopped hiding the wedding binder. It had been sitting for months on the bottom shelf of the hallway cabinet, behind a stack of cookbooks I hadn't opened in years. I had told myself I didn't want to throw it away because I might need the receipts, or because it was part of her story, and stories, even painful ones, deserve to be preserved. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't throw it away because some part of me still wanted it to mean something, still wanted it to be proof that I had been necessary. So instead of hiding it, I took it out. I placed it on the kitchen table one afternoon, poured myself a cup of tea, and went through every page, every invoice, every seating chart, every color-coded schedule. I touched each sheet like it was a wound that had finally scarred over. Then, slowly and without ceremony, I took it apart, not to destroy it, but to release it. Some pages I shredded, some I recycled. A few, like the florist's estimate written in my own handwriting, I tucked into the back of my notebook, not as a keepsake, but as part of the story I was now writing. By then, the notebook had grown thick. It was no longer just a record of financial betrayal or emotional exclusion. It had become a mirror, a daily conversation with myself. I wrote in it every morning now, sometimes pages at a time, sometimes only a paragraph. I didn't always write about Lila. More often, I wrote about what I was rediscovering: the satisfaction of pruning a plant just right, the taste of fresh bread eaten still warm, the odd joy of walking into a quiet house and knowing it was mine, undisturbed, intact. I no longer waited for Lila to call. I didn't check my phone for messages. I didn't try to decode her silence. It wasn't that I didn't care. It's that I had stopped needing the version of care she was willing to offer. Conditional, curated, shallow. I had begun to understand that not every daughter becomes a friend, and not every mother is owed a happy ending. One afternoon, Joyce and I sat in her garden, the air soft with that faint sweetness that only comes in April, and she said, without preamble, "You know, I think you're the freest I've ever seen you." It caught me off guard. I laughed, not in dismissal, but in recognition. "I think you might be right," I said, because I was. For the first time in decades, I was not performing a role. I was not dimming myself to fit someone else's brightness. I wasn't apologizing for taking up space. I was simply here, awake, still, entire, and I wasn't finished yet. The next true change didn't come as a grand realization or as some sudden decision born of a sleepless night. It came, as most real changes do, quietly, almost imperceptibly, while I was doing something utterly ordinary. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out an old glass jar to use for leftover soup, and as the water ran over my hands and the late morning light slipped across the counter, I found myself thinking, not of Lila, not of what had happened, but of what I had yet to do with the rest of my time. Not out of bitterness, not because I needed distraction, but because for the first time in years, maybe decades, I realized I had space in my life that wasn't already spoken for. The absence of obligation, that hollow, echoing silence I once feared, had become something else entirely. It had become a room, and it was mine to furnish. That afternoon, I pulled out a notebook that had long been buried beneath unpaid bills and clipped coupons, one I'd once bought for budgeting but never used. This time I filled the first page with ideas, not goals, not tasks, just a meandering list of things that had always been set aside for later. I wrote down places I had once dreamed of visiting, even if now the farthest I could reasonably go was a train ride away. I noted down the museum exhibits I had missed, the old friend I hadn't called back in years, the class I once considered taking in textile arts before Paul got sick. I didn't promise myself anything, I simply wrote. And it felt like reclaiming a kind of internal agency that had long been buried beneath layers of accommodation and delay. In the days that followed, I allowed that list to guide me in small, practical ways. I signed up for a Saturday morning workshop at the Adult Learning Centre. Something humble and entirely without pressure, just a beginner's introduction to hand quilting. The woman who taught it, a widow named Delia with silver hair pinned back by two mismatched clips, had a voice so soft it made everyone lean in slightly to hear her. I liked that. I liked that her presence didn't demand anything. I liked that in that room, nobody asked about children or marriages or what brought me there. We were all just women with fabric in our laps and pins between our fingers, learning to stitch something slow and beautiful out of scraps. There was something deeply honest about that. I also made a point of reaching out to people I had let slip away over the years. Not many, just a few women from church or the community centre, women whose company had once soothed me, but who I'd pushed aside when my life narrowed around Lila's orbit. I invited one of them, Eleanor, for tea on a windy Thursday, and as we sat in the living room, now arranged exactly as I liked it, the afternoon light warming the rug beneath our feet, I noticed how easy it felt to talk to someone who wasn't expecting me to play a role. We spoke of simple things: gardens, arthritis, the price of good coffee. But beneath that, I felt the faint hum of recognition, that I wasn't alone in what I had endured, that perhaps many of us had been slowly written out of our own stories without even noticing it. That evening, after Eleanor left, I sat with my notebook and tried to put words to something I hadn't said aloud, even to myself. Not all wounds are sharp. Some stretch across years, forming in layers, until what should have been a simple moment, a phone call, a wedding, a word of thanks, becomes the breaking point. I had never imagined that I would find myself outside the frame of my daughter's life so completely. But now that I was no longer standing on the threshold, waiting to be let back in, I could finally see the full shape of the house I had helped build. And more importantly, I could see that I no longer needed to knock. The next time I saw Lila was unexpected. I was leaving the grocery store, balancing two bags in my arms, one with tea and apples, the other with flour, and some new dish towels I didn't need but liked the look of, when I spotted her across the parking lot. She hadn't seen me. She was leaning into the passenger side window of a car I didn't recognize, talking to someone, her posture relaxed, her face turned in profile. She looked older, sharper somehow, more brittle at the edges than I remembered. But I didn't feel the pang I had anticipated. I didn't duck away. I didn't freeze. I simply watched her, quietly, for a few seconds, and then walked to my car. She saw me just as I opened the driver's door. Our eyes met. I waited for her to wave, to call out. But she didn't. She straightened, said something to the person in the car, and walked back around to the driver's seat without breaking stride. No smile, no gesture, just a glance, fast and unreadable. I sat in my car for a while after that, the keys still in my hand, my breath fogging up the windshield. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't surprised. What I felt, in that moment, was the quiet, irreversible truth that whatever had once lived between us, that deep, unspoken thread of mother and daughter, had been stretched too far. And it wasn't my place to reel it in anymore. That night, I opened my notebook again and wrote a single sentence, longer than usual, but steady. Some distances are not meant to be closed, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for them, is to stop reaching. Then I turned the page and kept writing. I had always imagined that the business of getting older would be mostly about waiting. Waiting for phone calls, for doctor's appointments, for the end of a season or the beginning of another one. I thought the days would stretch and blur into each other, filled with tea, television, maybe the occasional birthday card or neighbour's knock. But what I had not expected, and what I was only now beginning to understand, was that aging, real aging, the kind that settles into your bones with both wisdom and a certain impatience, could also be about sorting, about reckoning, about laying out everything you've carried for decades, all the objects, emotions, memories, loyalties, regrets, and asking one simple question: what do I want to take with me into what's left? It began, as these things often do, with a drawer, a single, overstuffed drawer in the hallway cabinet where I had long stored miscellaneous papers I didn't want to look at too closely. Bills, forms, expired warranties, donation solicitations, hand-scribbled notes from Lila when she was a child. I had kept it closed for years, half from laziness, half from fear of what I might find if I opened it. But one damp, quiet afternoon, with rain tapping against the windows like distant footsteps, I finally pulled the drawer fully out and dumped its contents onto the table. There were things I hadn't seen in decades: my marriage certificate, yellowing at the corners, a receipt from the hospital the day Lila was born, old insurance documents I no longer understood. As I sifted through the clutter, a strange feeling settled over me. Not quite sadness, not quite nostalgia, but something steadier. It was the sense of being the last steward of a life no one else remembered in full. There is something both lonely and powerful in that. I spent the better part of the week organizing. I created labeled folders: house, medical, accounts, legal, letters. I made notes on sticky tabs, color-coded things, not because anyone would see them, but because the process itself felt like a form of justice. This, I thought, is what order looks like after chaos. Not control, but clarity. Then I turned to the question I had been quietly avoiding, the question of inheritance. It was not a matter of wealth. My savings, even with everything I had set aside and rebuilt after the wedding, would not make headlines. But the house was paid off. My insurance policy was active. There were things that would be left behind. And for the first time, I no longer felt the old obligation to direct it all toward Lila, as if by doing so I could rewrite what had happened or purchase her love retroactively. Instead, I sat with Victor again, this time bringing my carefully arranged folders and my newly clarified sense of intention. We reviewed the language in my existing will. He asked, gently, if I wanted to make changes. "I do," I said. He didn't press me on why. He didn't need to. I chose to divide what I had differently. A portion would go to an education fund for children at the community centre, where I'd begun volunteering once a week, folding donated clothing and organising shelves with other quiet women in their 60s and 70s who rarely spoke of their pasts. Another portion I directed to a local foundation that provided legal aid to elder women in financial disputes, a cause I would never have thought of before, but which now felt personal. The house, I decided, would pass not directly to Lila, but into a trust with stipulations designed to prevent immediate liquidation. She would be notified, of course, but she would not be handed the keys like an heir to a kingdom she had chosen to leave behind. Victor asked again, carefully, if I wanted to include a personal letter. I hesitated, then declined, not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer needed to be heard. The act of decision was enough. When I signed the documents, crisp, notarized, clean, I felt something unspool in my chest. Not vengeance, not triumph, just release. A soft, steady exhale after years of holding my breath. That evening, I went for a walk, the sky low with the kind of soft grey that made every leaf seem more vivid. The air was cool and slightly sweet, and for once, I didn't rush. I didn't think of what I'd forgotten at the store, or whether the porch light was on. I let my feet move slowly over the uneven pavement, past houses where porch lights flickered and radios hummed behind screen doors. I passed the elementary school where I had once waited for Lila, holding a thermos of tea, always the last parent to leave. I passed the park where Paul used to take her on Sundays, pushing her gently on the swings while I watched from a bench, always more tired than I let them see. And as I walked, it struck me just how much of my life had been spent near things, but not within them. I had been adjacent to joy, adjacent to partnership, adjacent to honor, close enough to touch, but never quite invited to sit fully inside it. That time, I realized, had ended. I would no longer accept adjacency, and though I didn't know what would fill the space that remained, what new relationships, routines, or revelations would take shape, I knew one thing with perfect clarity. Whatever came next would have room for me, not just as a backdrop or a resource, but as a whole, complex person with nothing left to prove. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, plain and unmarked, except for my name in Lila's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting. The same handwriting I had once praised. When she learned to form her letters in second grade, the same loops and careful curves she had used to write birthday cards and college applications, back when every word she gave me still carried weight. For a moment, I just stared at it, the envelope resting on the kitchen table beside my cup of tea, and the library book I'd been halfway through. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. Even before breaking the seal, I understood that whatever was inside was not apology, not acknowledgment, but something else. A gesture made not out of understanding, but out of necessity, and maybe even calculation. When I finally opened it, I found a neatly typed note inside, short and impersonal, as though she had borrowed the tone from one of her workplace memos. It read, "Hi, Mum. I hope you're well. I wanted to let you know that Jeremy and I are planning a housewarming gathering next month at the new place. It'll be informal, just friends and close family. Of course, we'd love for you to come. Let me know if you need directions. Lila." There was no mention of the wedding, no inquiry about how I'd been, no expression of interest, remorse, or warmth. Just an invitation delivered like an obligation, thinly wrapped in social convention. And though I knew, from a purely external perspective, that it might seem like a gesture of goodwill, a daughter reaching out, to me, it read differently. It read like a test, or perhaps a reset. as though everything that had happened could be swept aside by an invitation and a vague smile. As though I might still accept my place at the edge of her life, so long as the door, however conditionally, remained open. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my notebook, not to treasure it, but to preserve the record. Not all wounds require confrontation. Some are best acknowledged in silence, in still decisions made without anger, and I had made mine. I didn't respond. Not that day, not the next, and not when a follow-up text came through a week later, breezy and casual. "Hey, just checking if you got my note. Hope you can come," would mean a lot. That phrase, "would mean a lot," stuck in my throat. I had spent most of my life giving meaning to other people's moments. I had made birthdays happen, baked cakes late at night, stitched hems on dresses she had decided to wear last minute, rewritten my entire schedule to accommodate her teenage drama, her college visits, her postgraduate panic. And now, suddenly, I was meant to supply significance again. This time not with presents, but with forgiveness I had not been asked to give. I set the phone down and went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet that morning, the air cool with the first signs of early summer. I passed blooming hydrangeas, uneven sidewalks, the sound of distant lawnmowers and birds busy in the trees. Each step felt deliberate, grounding. I wasn't angry. I was aware. That was the difference now. I had crossed some invisible line inside myself, a place where pain no longer dictated behavior. I didn't need to punish Lila, but I didn't need to reward her either, especially not with my presence. The housewarming came and went. I heard about it later, through Joyce, who had seen photos online, through a woman at the market whose granddaughter had been invited. It was, by all accounts, a lovely event. Lila looked radiant, Jeremy proud. There were cocktails, curated lighting, catered hors d'oeuvres, laughter echoing against high ceilings and polished floors. No one noticed my absence, or if they did, they didn't say. And I didn't ache for it. I had spent too many years being present in rooms where my presence was assumed, but not truly valued. Instead, I spent that evening in my sewing room, working on a quilt I had started weeks earlier. A large, heavy piece with rich earth tones and fine hand-stitching that calmed me. Each square of fabric came from something I had once worn, a dress from the 70s, a scarf Paul had given me for our anniversary, an old apron from my baking days. As I worked, I thought about how much of life is pieced together from fragments, memories, textures, things we didn't expect to keep, but somehow couldn't throw away. The quilt was not perfect. Some lines curved slightly, some patterns clashed. But it was mine, through and through. And when I draped it over the back of my armchair, I felt something like permanence settle into the room. In the following days, I noticed something else. The lack of follow-up. Lila didn't call to ask why I hadn't come. She didn't send a message to express disappointment. There was no second letter, no confrontation. Just silence. The kind of silence that told me she hadn't expected me to say no, or perhaps hadn't cared much whether I came at all, as long as the invitation had been issued. That stung more than I wanted to admit. But it also clarified everything. A few weeks later, I found myself at the community centre again, helping sort donations in the back room, where everything smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. There, among boxes of baby clothes and mismatched shoes, I spoke with a woman named Janice, 72, wiry and dry-witted, a retired school nurse who had outlived 2 husbands and 3 cancers. We didn't speak much about our personal lives, but that afternoon, when I mentioned I had recently updated my will, she looked at me and said, with a kind of sideways smile, "It's funny, isn't it? The older we get, the more we realize that love isn't about who shows up at the table. It's about who remembers to pull out your chair without being asked. Her words stayed with me. That night, I wrote a single, uninterrupted entry in my notebook. Not a list, not a report, but a letter to myself. I wrote about the years I had given, the rooms I had entered quietly, the affection I had waited to be given back. I wrote about the silence I had endured, the kindness I had offered even when it wasn't returned, and the invitation I had declined, not as revenge, but as a boundary. And at the end of that letter, I wrote the clearest sentence I'd written in months. This is what it feels like to choose peace over permission. Then I closed the book, turned off the light, and let the house hold me. Fully, freely, and without apology. Summer unfolded slowly that year, not with fanfare or sudden heat, but with a kind of hesitant warmth, as though even the season was unsure whether it had the right to arrive. The days stretched longer. Light poured through the kitchen window in the early mornings, and the air began to carry the scent of ripe earth and something almost sweet, like memory softened by time. I found myself moving through those days differently, not rushing, not planning, but inhabiting. I cooked without urgency. I read books without underlining or annotating, just to be in someone else's thoughts for a while. I sat on the porch in the evenings with a glass of iced tea and listened to the world breathe around me. And most of all, I stopped performing grief. That was perhaps the biggest shift of all. Letting go of the idea that I needed to carry sorrow like a badge to prove that what had happened mattered. I had spent so much time holding space for pain, for disappointment, for what I had expected from Lila and what had never arrived, that I hadn't realized how much space it had taken up inside me. It had become a kind of scaffolding around my life, invisible, but rigid. And the longer I lived inside it, the harder it had become to see anything else. But now, with each quiet morning, with each afternoon spent volunteering or stitching, with each dinner made for no one but myself, the scaffolding weakened. I could breathe again, not because I had forgotten, but because I had decided not to let absence define the shape of my days. Around that time, something strange began to happen. Something I hadn't expected. People started to notice. It began with Joyce, who dropped off a loaf of banana bread one Thursday and stayed to sit with me in the garden. She looked at me closely, as though trying to understand what had changed, then said, without any preamble, "You look more like yourself than I've seen in years." I smiled, not politely, but genuinely, and said, "I feel more like myself." And it was true. Not the self I had been as a wife, or as Lila's mother, or as someone's dependable friend, but the self I might have been all along, had I not made so much room for everyone else's expectations. Then came a woman from the quilting class, a soft-spoken widow named June, who invited me to join a monthly group that met in her sunroom for wine, conversation, and handwork. "No projects, no goals," she said. "Just good company, and the understanding that sometimes you need to be around people who won't ask you to explain yourself." I went. I brought cookies. I said almost nothing the first time. But when I left, there was a stillness in me that felt a lot like belonging. Even at the community pantry, the woman who ran the front table, a brisk, no-nonsense former nurse named Edna, began assigning me tasks without double-checking. It was a small thing, really, but I noticed it. The way she no longer looked over my shoulder, the way she trusted that the boxes would be sorted, the supplies counted, the labels matched. I had moved, in her eyes, from outsider to integral. Not because I had asked, but because I had simply stayed. Consistently, without drama, without asking to be thanked. These tiny shifts, these recognitions, were not loud or cinematic. No one gave speeches. No one called me brave. But in their own quiet way, they affirmed something I had not even realized I had begun to believe, that I did not need to be someone's mother, wife, or victim to matter. I did not need to be included in family photographs or seated at someone else's table to have worth. I had a place. I had chosen it. I had built it. And then, one afternoon, Lila called. Not a text, not an email, an actual phone call. The first since before the wedding. I was in the backyard, cutting back the overgrown lavender, when I heard the ring echo through the open screen door. I wiped my hands, walked to the kitchen, and stared at the screen. Her name glowed in the center. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel longing. I simply answered. Her voice was careful, too careful, polished, like something rehearsed. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She mentioned the weather. I agreed it had been nice. Then she paused and asked if I had time to catch up soon, maybe over lunch. I waited, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to give the silence space to reveal what wasn't being said. I don't think I'm ready for that yet, I replied, my voice calm, even. But thank you for reaching out. There was another pause, longer this time. Then she said, I understand. But I don't think she did. Not really. I think she thought I was hurt, that I was waiting for a proper apology. But I wasn't. What I needed from her was not a performance of remorse. What I needed, and still hadn't received, was the capacity to see me not just as a role she could call upon when it suited her, but as a person with limits, needs, and the right to say no. We ended the call politely. I stood for a while in the kitchen afterward, the smell of lavender still clinging to my fingertips, and I felt peaceful, not triumphant, not vindicated, just steady. That night, I returned to my notebook. I wrote not about the call, but about the garden. I described the way the lavender had grown wild around the stone path, the bees that hovered with purpose, the feel of the sun on my shoulders as I worked. And then I wrote a single line that came to me without hesitation. This life, as it is now, is enough. And I meant it. The final shift, when it came, wasn't announced. It didn't break into my life like a storm, didn't shake the windows or force me to run for cover. Instead, it arrived the way true endings often do, not with noise, but with stillness. It was a Tuesday morning, not unlike any other, when I sat down with my tea, opened the kitchen window, and realized that for the first time in years, there was nothing inside me pulling, pushing, aching for something to be different. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for a call, not for closure, not for recognition. I was simply here, not healed in the storybook sense, not untouched by sorrow, but steady. And that, I had come to understand, was its own kind of peace. The garden had bloomed late that summer, but fully. The lavender, once unruly, now grew in thick, fragrant rows. The tomatoes ripened all at once, bursting with colour. The birds that came each morning, chickadees, robins, one bold cardinal, had grown used to me, and I to them. My days unfolded slowly, and yet they felt full, with small, quiet joys that asked nothing of me but presence. I baked a peach tart with fruit from the market. I reread old books not for insight, but for comfort. I mended the fraying hem of a cardigan I'd owned for decades. I called Eleanor and Joyce without needing an excuse. And in doing all this, I felt, finally, at home in my life. Not the life I once built around others, but the one I had carefully, quietly rebuilt around myself. Lila didn't call again. Months passed. I saw traces of her now and then, a tagged photo on someone's feed, a mention in passing from a neighbour. She was still living in the house I had helped them fund with the last of my deferred dreams. I no longer checked to see if she had reached out. I no longer rehearsed speeches in my head, imagining a confrontation that might never come. There was a time when I believed healing required that moment. The tearful apology, the reckoning, the embrace. But that was before I learned the quieter truth, that sometimes the greatest justice is not in the reversal of what was done, but in the life you choose to build in spite of it. In the early fall, I received a letter, not from Lila, but from a distant cousin, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had attended the wedding. She wrote with casual affection, updating me on her grandchildren, her new dog, her plans for retirement. And at the end, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I always thought it was strange what happened at the wedding. I noticed you weren't there." I wanted to say, "I saw it, even if no one said anything." I folded the letter slowly, my chest tightening in that old, familiar place. I had not realized how much I needed to hear those words, not from Lila, but from anyone. That someone else had seen me. That my absence had been felt not just as an empty chair, but as a question, a missing piece. And for once, I didn't feel the urge to call, to explain, to reopen old wounds. I simply placed the letter in the back of my notebook and wrote beneath it, "I am not invisible. I never was." As the months turned cooler, I began making plans, not out of urgency, but out of intention. I booked a weekend trip with the quilting women, a quiet retreat in the woods with more thread than conversation, more warmth than noise. I arranged my finances for long-term independence. I subscribed to a gardening magazine. I began drafting small essays, not for anyone else to read, but to gather my thoughts into something that felt whole. Not every day was joyful. Some were quiet in the sad way, others in the sacred one. But never again did I feel like a guest in my own story. One morning, while trimming the dead blooms from a potted geranium, I thought of Lila, not with bitterness, not with longing, but with a kind of soft, resigned compassion. She had made her choices. So had I. I would always be her mother. That thread could not be cut. But motherhood, I had come to believe, did not mean permanence in someone's life at the cost of your own. It meant giving, yes, but not surrendering. And in reclaiming what I had surrendered, I had not become less of a mother. I had become more of myself. I sat in the garden until the sun warmed the back of my neck and the shadows shortened. Then I stood, wiped my hands on my apron, and went inside. The house was quiet, mine, and that, at last, was enough.